I knew something was wrong the second I saw the bright paper clipped to my mailbox, fluttering like it was proud of itself. By noon, they said, a tow truck could be called if my violation wasn't corrected. Not tomorrow. Not next week. By noon. And as I stood there, still in yesterday's t-shirt, I realized this wasn't really about my driveway at all. It was about control. It was about who got to be comfortable and who got to be managed. And if I didn't move fast, I wouldn't just lose a parking spot. I'd lose leverage. The funny part is I wasn't even doing anything dramatic. My car was in my own driveway, straight, not blocking anything, not leaking anything, not loud, not half on the sidewalk. It was the kind of thing you don't notice unless you're searching for a reason to notice it. And the threat hanging at the bottom of that paper wasn't subtle. Tow at owner's expense. Administrative fee. Escalated penalties, if not resolved by the deadline. I'd seen petty before, sure. Everyone who lives under an association long enough collects stories like unwanted coupons. But this felt different, like someone had finally decided to stop posturing and start swinging. I went inside, set the paper on the counter, and made coffee I didn't really want. The kitchen light was too bright for that hour, and the morning air smelled like wet asphalt from last night's sprinkle. I stared at the notice again, reading it slowly, like it might change if I stared hard enough. It wasn't even personalized. No name. No specific explanation beyond unauthorized driveway parking. That phrase made my jaw tighten because it was both vague and confident, like it was daring me to argue. I wasn't going to argue. Not out loud. Because the last time I tried the normal approach, the polite approach, I got punished for it. My neighborhood looks like the kind of place people imagine when they hear the words planned community. Neat lawns. Clean sidewalks. Matching mailboxes. The same 3 trees planted in the same 3 spots like a stencil. I moved in because I wanted quiet. I wanted predictable. I wanted a place where I didn't have to guess whether my neighbor's project car would become a permanent monument 2 feet from my bedroom window. At first, it was fine. Then the committee started doing what committees do. They got bored. It began with little things that felt almost harmless in isolation. A reminder about trash bins needing to be stored out of view within a reasonable time frame. A newsletter paragraph about harmonious exterior presentation. A general note about driveway use that was written like everyone had suddenly become a criminal. I'd skim those emails and move on with my life, because I wasn't the kind of person who wanted to be at war with a binder full of rules. My house looked good. My yard looked good. I paid my dues on time. I waved at neighbors, kept my head down, and then Ms. D moved in across the way. She didn't announce herself with anything dramatic, not at first. No big party. No moving truck chaos. Just a few weeks of curtains shifting whenever someone walked by, and then she started doing that thing where she'd stand at the edge of her driveway like she was inspecting the whole street. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She had the kind of posture that says she believes the world is responsible for her comfort. The first time I clocked her attention on me, I was washing my car on a Saturday. Not blasting music. Not making a mess. Just a bucket, a sponge, and a quiet morning. I looked up and she was watching, arms folded, face pinched like she was doing math. A few days later, I received a courtesy reminder about water runoff. There wasn't any runoff. I was washing on the driveway like everyone else. And when I looked around, I noticed the same thing I always did. Other people did way worse and nothing happened. One neighbor had a truck that seemed to live half on the curb. Another had a trailer that appeared every other weekend like a recurring guest. Nobody blinked. But I got a reminder. That was the first time the word selective enforcement floated into my mind. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't accuse anybody. I just filed the email away in a folder I jokingly called Neighborhood Fun. Then came the second time, and it wasn't about water. It was about my driveway. I have a normal driveway. 2 cars could fit if you're careful. I park one. Sometimes, if I have groceries, I pull up a little closer to the garage. That's it. My car never stays in the street overnight because I like keeping the road clear. It feels respectful. Apparently, it also made me an easy target. The first driveway notice was polite, which is how most nonsense starts. It said something like the association had received concerns about driveway parking and wanted to clarify community expectations. No specific violation, no mention of time, no mention of harm. Just a vibe. I did what a reasonable person does. I checked the governing documents. I pulled up the association's rules packet and found the section on parking. It was buried under decorative fences and acceptable shades of beige, but it was there. And it wasn't what the notice implied. The rule talked about commercial vehicles, oversized vehicles, and unregistered vehicles. It talked about not blocking sidewalks and not parking on the lawn. It did not say I couldn't park my personal car in my own driveway. So I replied, calmly, and asked for clarification. I didn't rant. I didn't threaten. I didn't insult anyone. I wrote a simple message explaining I'd reviewed the rules and didn't see a violation, and asked them to point me to the specific section they were referencing. No answer came for a week. When it finally did, it was a generic response that didn't address my question. It said the association expects driveways to be used for vehicle storage in a manner consistent with community aesthetics. That phrase, community aesthetics, is how rules become weapons. It's not measurable. It's not consistent. It can mean anything to anyone, which means it usually means whatever the loudest person wants it to mean. I asked again, even more specifically this time, for the exact rule number. If it's a rule, it has a number. That's how rule books work. If it doesn't have a number, it's just someone's opinion in a committee-shaped costume. Still, no real answer. Around then, I started noticing Ms. D's patterns. She didn't just watch. She documented. She'd take her phone out when cars pulled up. She'd step outside when someone's trash can stayed out a little too long. She'd stand at the end of her driveway during the late afternoon, staring across the street like she was waiting for something to happen. It felt ridiculous until it didn't. Because after her watching came the enforcement. A second notice arrived, more official-looking, with bold print and sharper language. This one cited a rule number, finally, but it wasn't even about driveway parking. It was a catch-all clause about nuisances and improper use of property. That was when I realized I wasn't dealing with a normal complaint process. I was dealing with someone trying to fit me into a violation because they decided I belonged there. My neighborhood fun folder stopped being a joke. I printed the notices. I saved screenshots. I took pictures of my driveway, my car, the sidewalk. I documented the date and time. I even measured the distance from my tires to the edge of the walkway because I had the strange feeling I was going to need to prove something that should never need proving. I also started keeping a simple log. Nothing dramatic, just a running note in a notebook. Date, what I received, what I observed, what I replied. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. A few days passed, and the association's tone softened again, like they were trying to reset the table after flipping it. I got a newsletter about community pride. I got a reminder about holiday decorations being taken down on time. Normal stuff. Then the morning of the tow threat arrived. I had parked in my driveway the night before like always. My car wasn't special. The street wasn't blocked. The garage wasn't open. The curtains were closed. Nothing about it should have sparked anything. But the notice was there, and the deadline was carved into it like a dare. Tow authorization pending. Compliance required by noon today. And right underneath it was the line that made my stomach tighten. Failure to comply may result in towing at the owner's expense and additional administrative penalties. They jumped from vague aesthetics, language to immediate financial consequences. That's not escalation by accident. That's escalation because someone thinks you'll fold. I didn't fold. I took a photo of the notice where it sat on my counter, then another photo of it in my hand, then another photo of where it had been clipped to the mailbox. I made sure the timestamp on my phone was visible in the metadata. Then I walked outside and took wide shots. My driveway from the street, my car, the sidewalk, the curb, the whole scene. I'd learned something about these situations. If you leave any room for interpretation, interpretation will be weaponized. Back inside, I pulled up the rules packet again, and this time I wasn't skimming. I was hunting. There it was, the same section I'd seen before. Parking rules. Prohibited vehicles. Street restrictions. No mention of private vehicles being forbidden in driveways. No mention of towing for driveway parking unless you were blocking access or violating a posted rule. So where did this tow threat come from? That question mattered, because it meant either the committee was inventing authority it didn't have, or they were selectively applying a rule they never applied to anyone else. Either way, it was an HOA nightmare in the most classic sense. Not the rules themselves, but the people using them like a personal remote control. I checked the notice again. It listed a violation code instead of a real rule citation, which is a trick. A code is internal. A code sounds official. A code makes you feel like you're already guilty. But a code isn't a covenant. If they wanted to tow my car, I needed them pinned to something concrete. So I did the only thing that actually works in these situations. I started building a paper trail they couldn't wriggle out of. First, I wrote a short email response. I kept it calm and direct. I referenced the notice date and the exact language about towing by noon. I asked them to provide the specific governing document section authorizing towing for parking a personal vehicle in a driveway that does not block access. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I didn't rant about fairness. I asked for the authority. Then, because email alone can disappear into the void, I made it more official on my end. I attached the photo of my driveway, the photo of my car, and the screenshot of the relevant parking rules section from the rules packet. I included the page number. I included the section heading. I also saved a copy of the email as a PDF and named it with the date, because I'd learned the hard way that if you rely on someone else's system to preserve your record, you've already lost. Next, I pulled up the association's meeting minutes archive. Most people don't bother. They see a wall of PDFs and give up. But I had a reason to look. Towing threats don't come from nowhere. Either they'd voted on something, or they were claiming they had. The archive was messy, and that alone told me a lot. Some months were missing. Some agendas were posted late. Some minutes were just bullet points with no detail. It felt less like transparent governance and more like a scrapbook of whatever they felt like sharing. I searched for the word tow. Nothing. I searched for the word driveway. A few mentions, mostly about reminders and community image. No formal tow policy. No towing vendor authorization. No announcement. Which meant the notice wasn't grounded in an openly approved policy. It was either new and unannounced, or it was being used on me without being used on others. And that's when I remembered something Ms. D had done the week before. She'd been standing near the sidewalk when a friend of mine stopped by for 20 minutes to drop something off. Nothing loud. Nothing messy. Just a quick visit. I watched from inside as she stared at his car like she was memorizing the license plate with her eyes. After he left, she walked back to her porch, satisfied, like she'd completed a task. That memory clicked into place with the tow threat and made the whole thing feel less random. Someone had decided my driveway was a battleground, and the committee was letting that person point the cannon. I went back outside and looked around, slowly, like I was seeing the street for the first time. 2 houses down, a car sat halfway up a driveway with its bumper nearly touching the sidewalk. Across the street, someone had a pickup angled so far to one side it could have been a mistake. Farther down, a vehicle was clearly parked in a way that would have been more aesthetically offensive than anything I'd done. No notices on their mailboxes. No bright paper flapping in the breeze. No urgency. No threat of towing by noon. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a misunderstanding. This was a test. And the test was simple. Would I panic and comply without asking questions? Because if I did, then they could do anything next. Today it's the driveway. Tomorrow it's the paint shade. Next week it's a fine schedule update. And by the time you realize you're being managed, you're already trained to obey. I wasn't going to be trained. I went back inside and opened my notebook log again. I wrote the date and described the tow notice. I noted the exact deadline. I listed what I'd observed on the street about other driveway parking situations. I kept it factual, not emotional. Then I created a second folder in my computer, more serious than neighborhood fun. I labeled it Tow Threat Documentation. It made me feel a little ridiculous, but I'd rather feel ridiculous than feel powerless. I had one more move before noon, and it wasn't confrontation. It wasn't arguing on the sidewalk. It wasn't storming into a meeting. It was something quieter. I drafted a formal records request, the kind that forces people to either comply or reveal that they can't. I asked for any policy, rule, or board resolution authorizing towing for driveway parking of personal vehicles. I requested any correspondence or complaint record associated with my address for the last 30 days. I asked for the enforcement log showing similar violations and how they were handled. I kept it concise and professional because the goal wasn't to vent. The goal was to put a spotlight on inconsistency without ever using the word inconsistent. If the committee had a legitimate policy, they'd produce it. If they didn't, they'd stall. If they stalled, I'd have proof that the deadline was a bluff designed to scare me. And if they produced an enforcement log that showed my driveway was the only one getting targeted, then I'd have the foundation I needed to expose what this really was. By then, I could feel my pulse settling into something colder. Less panic, more focus. That's the shift people don't expect from you when they try to scare you. They expect scrambling. They expect pleading. They expect you to move your car and apologize for existing. Instead, I was documenting everything, building a clean chain of facts, and tightening the loop around their own claims. Because the thing about a deadline is it cuts both ways. And as noon crept closer, I realized the tow threat wasn't the real danger. The real danger was what they'd do if they learned I wouldn't flinch. I didn't wait for a reply. Waiting is how people like this win. They delay, you doubt yourself, and by the time you regain your footing, the deadline has passed and they're acting like the consequences were inevitable. So I treated noon like a moving target and started stacking protections in my favor. First, I walked back outside and took one more set of photos, slower this time. Not just my car and driveway, but the street view in both directions. I made sure the angles showed the curb line, the sidewalk clearance, and the fact that my vehicle wasn't obstructing anything. Then I zoomed in on the tow notice itself and captured every number and code printed on it. If they later claimed it said something different, they'd have to argue with their own paper. Next, I checked the community rules packet again, but I focused on enforcement procedure instead of the parking section. Most associations hide their sharpest tools inside the process language: how notices are issued, how deadlines work, what constitutes due process, what rights a homeowner has to request a hearing. Buried in the middle was a paragraph that mattered. It said violations required notice and an opportunity to be heard before penalties were imposed, except in emergency situations that posed immediate risk or safety concerns. Emergency. Like a gas leak. Like a blocked fire lane. Like a fallen tree across a sidewalk. Not like a sedan sitting politely in my driveway. That was my first evidence prop with real weight, and I treated it like gold. I saved a screenshot with the page number visible and dropped it into my folder. I also printed it because I wanted something physical if things got chaotic. I labeled it at the top in pen, Procedure Section, Enforcement Timeline. Then I did something that felt strange but necessary. I stopped thinking like the one being accused and started thinking like the one building a case. If this was selective enforcement, then the proof wouldn't be in my driveway. It would be in the pattern. So I took a slow walk down the street, phone in hand, not obvious, not creeping, just a casual loop like I was stretching my legs. I photographed driveway parking that matched or exceeded what they were accusing me of. I kept it respectful. No close-ups of license plates. No faces. Just the general situation. Vehicles parked in driveways, bumpers near sidewalks, even one car partially angled over the walkway line in a way that would actually inconvenience someone. And I made sure the timestamps were there. This wasn't about tattling. This was about establishing that the rule, whatever they claimed it was, wasn't being applied evenly. Back home, I sat down at my kitchen table and checked the time. I still had hours before noon, but my stomach kept acting like the clock was already screaming. That's the trick with a deadline threat. It hijacks your brain. I opened my email. No response yet. So I sent the records request. I made it formal but not dramatic. I referenced the tow notice date and stated I was requesting specific items: any board-approved towing policy, any contract or authorization form that would permit towing from a homeowner's driveway, any enforcement log showing comparable driveway parking violations and resulting actions for the past 60 days, and any complaint record tied to my address. I also requested the identity of the party who issued the tow notice, not by name, but by role. Property manager, compliance officer, board member. I wanted to know which bucket this came from. Then I sent a second email, separate, to the general board contact address. Same tone, same request, slightly shorter. The reason for the duplicate wasn't spite, it was strategy. People love plausible deniability. If I only messaged one inbox, they could claim it was missed. 2 inboxes, 2 sent timestamps, 1 problem they couldn't shrug off. I saved both emails as PDFs and added them to the folder. And then I did the thing I always used to avoid because it felt too confrontational. I asked for a hearing. Not a yelling mash. Not a public spectacle. A formal hearing, the kind their own rules referenced. I requested it in writing and asked for the earliest available time. I knew they'd likely refuse to schedule it before noon, which was the point. If they towed my car without giving me a hearing, they'd be ignoring their own process. If they refused a hearing and still threatened towing, that would look even worse. Either way, I was creating a clean record that I was engaging properly, while they were acting impulsively. Still no response. The silence made the whole neighborhood feel louder. Somewhere down the block, a lawn crew started up, the whine of a blower cutting through the air, and for a second I imagined a tow truck's engine instead. That's how my mind was running now. Every sound felt like a warning. I looked outside again. Ms. D's curtains shifted. Not a lot. Just enough to catch the movement. Like she was waiting to see if I'd move the car. Like she was waiting to see if I'd surrender. I didn't. Instead, I made a decision that felt petty but necessary. I went back to the mailbox and checked it again, as if another notice might magically appear. It didn't. But while I was standing there, I noticed something else. The tow threat paper wasn't the usual association letterhead. It wasn't the normal template they'd used on earlier notices. The font was different. The formatting was off. The violation code looked like it had been pulled from a spreadsheet, not a standardized system. That detail mattered, because it suggested someone had created this notice outside the normal process. Maybe a board member. Maybe a self-appointed compliance crusader. Maybe someone who thought they could bully with paperwork as long as it looked official enough. I photographed the back of the notice too, just in case there were printer marks or anything else that could tie it to a home printer instead of a management office. Then I went back inside and wrote a new log entry. Notice template inconsistent with prior notices. No official letterhead. No proper rule citation. Deadline unusually aggressive. I could feel the story writing itself in a way I didn't like. A classic homeowners association drama situation where the rules become a weapon, and the person pushing the weapon isn't even doing it correctly, just loudly. That's when my phone buzzed. An email. My heartbeat jumped like it had been slapped. It was from the association's general inbox, short and cold. It didn't answer my question. It didn't address the rule citation request. It didn't mention towing authority. It said they had confirmed a violation and expected immediate compliance, and that further discussion could be handled after the violation is corrected. After. That word was the whole game. Comply first, debate later. Once you comply, you've admitted guilt. Once you admit guilt, they can escalate whenever they want because you've proven you'll fold. I didn't fold. I replied immediately, politely, and repeated the same request. Please identify the exact governing document section authorizing towing from a private driveway for parking a personal vehicle that does not block access or create an emergency. I also asked them to confirm in writing whether they intended to tow before providing a hearing opportunity. Then I did something else that changed the whole mood of the morning. I stopped treating this like it was happening in private. Not in a dramatic, social media way. Not in a screaming on the street way. I contacted 2 neutral witnesses. In my neighborhood, there are a few people who stay out of everything. They're the kind of folks who wave, keep their yards clean, and never show up to meetings unless something is truly ridiculous. I'd spoken to one of them a few times, a retired guy who always walked his dog at the same hour. Another was a woman who worked from home and had seen plenty of committee drama but never participated. I didn't tell them I was launching a crusade. I didn't ask them to take sides. I asked for something simple. If a tow truck showed up, could they confirm what they saw? The time. The position of the vehicle. Whether there was any obstruction. Whether anyone from the association was present. Neutral observation. That's all. They both responded in the way sane people respond to insanity, with disbelief and cautious willingness to help. And just like that, the tow threat stopped feeling like a private intimidation tactic and started feeling like a spotlight moment the committee didn't realize they were stepping into. The next hour moved with a weird kind of clarity. I kept my phone volume up. I kept my email open. I refreshed the inbox too often. But I didn't pace. I didn't scramble. I just kept documenting. I printed the tow notice. I printed the emails. I printed the enforcement procedure page. I stapled them in chronological order. I wrote one more note on top of the stack. Final notice received this morning, tow threatened by noon. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop in a different way. The deadline wasn't just about towing. It was about humiliation. If a tow truck came into the neighborhood in broad daylight, it wouldn't just inconvenience me. It would send a message to everyone watching. This is what happens when you don't comply. People would peek through blinds. They'd whisper. They'd assume I must have done something wrong. The committee would look powerful and I'd look like a problem. Social shame was baked into the threat. And that, more than the money, was what made it vicious. Because once your neighbors believe you're the problem, the committee can do anything. They can isolate you. They can frame every future interaction as you being difficult. They can turn a rules disagreement into a character judgment. The association inbox stayed silent after my last reply. No rule citation. No policy. No acknowledgement of my records request. And the closer the clock moved toward noon, the more certain I became that they weren't relying on authority. They were relying on fear. I watched the street through my front window, not like I was hiding, but like I was waiting for the moment they thought they'd win. The sun had climbed enough to throw sharp shadows across the sidewalks, and a few neighbors were out doing normal weekend things. A jogger. A kid on a bike far down the block. Someone dragging a trash bin back in. Normal life. And yet I felt like I was sitting in the middle of a trap door. At about 15 minutes before noon, a car rolled slowly past my house and didn't belong. It wasn't a neighbor's. It wasn't someone visiting. It moved too slowly, like it was scanning. Like it was checking. It passed, turned the corner, and disappeared. My pulse ticked up again. I checked the driveway. My car was still there. I checked my email. Still nothing meaningful. And then, right before noon, another message came in. This one was different. It was from a person, not the generic inbox. A signature with a roll on the board. It stated they were reviewing my request and that towing may be paused, pending clarification, but they still expected immediate correction of the violation. May be paused. Not will be paused. They were still trying to keep me uncertain. I replied with one sentence that I knew would irritate them because it was simple and unavoidable. Please confirm in writing that no tow will be initiated today prior to providing the governing authority and an opportunity to be heard. Then I stopped typing. Because the next phase wasn't going to be one with more words. It was going to be one with what they did next, on the record, with witnesses, under their own deadline. And as the noon hour hit, I realized the tow threat had already given me something I hadn't had before. It gave me a clean line in time. A moment where they either backed down or exposed themselves. The noon hour landed like a weight on my chest, but nothing happened immediately. No rumbling diesel. No flashing lights. No stranger stepping out with a clipboard and an attitude. For a few minutes, the street looked almost insultingly normal, like the association had thrown a tantrum in private and expected me to forget it the moment the clock turned. I didn't forget. I sat at my kitchen table with my printed stack, my phone face up, and my email open like it was a courtroom. If they were going to back down, I wanted it in writing. If they weren't, I wanted witnesses. Another message arrived from the same board roll a little after noon, still slippery, still trying to keep me uncertain. It said they were reviewing and that enforcement would proceed according to community standards. Nothing about towing. Nothing about a hearing. Nothing about authority. That told me everything. They wanted me to move my car without them committing to a position on paper. They wanted compliance without accountability. So I did the next step of retaliation, and it wasn't loud. I made my own deadline. I responded that I would not be moving my vehicle based on an uncited violation code and an unconfirmed tow threat, and that any further enforcement action should be paused until the requested policy and enforcement records were provided. Then I attached the same evidence again, the tow notice photo, the driveway photo, and the procedure page about notice and hearing. I made it impossible for them to pretend they didn't know what I was referencing. After I hit send, I felt my hands stop shaking. It wasn't confidence. It was clarity. If they were going to push, they'd have to do it over a clean trail of documentation. Then I did something that felt almost comically basic, but it mattered. I moved my car a few inches. Not out of the driveway. Not into the garage. Just a small adjustment so it sat perfectly centered, with an obvious buffer from the sidewalk line. The whole point was to remove even the tiniest excuse. If they tried to argue it was too close, my new photos would show it wasn't. If they tried to argue it was crooked, it wasn't. I took new photos from the same angles as before, so the comparison was obvious. And then I waited, not passively, but deliberately. Every time I checked the street, I noted it in my log. Every time I checked email, I noted it. If a tow truck arrived, I wanted a clear timeline that showed I wasn't hiding or dodging or scrambling. It was around then that I spotted Ms. D again, lingering near her window. The curtain edge moved, then stilled, then moved again. She didn't step outside. She didn't wave. She didn't do anything visible enough to accuse her of anything. But she watched. And I could practically feel her waiting for the moment my driveway turned into a spectacle. That's when the next rehook hit me like a cold splash. If the committee didn't get their tow victory, they could pivot to something worse. Fines that stack daily. Administrative fees, with vague descriptions. A forced hearing scheduled at a time designed to make me miss it, so they could claim I failed to appear. Once the process becomes a weapon, every step can be turned into a legal consequence-shaped threat without anyone ever saying the word legal. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story that way. I pulled up my records request again and sent a follow-up, tightening it. I asked for the enforcement log in particular, the kind of document that shows whether the association was consistent or whether they were using me as an example. I also requested the board agenda excerpt from the last meeting where towing authority was supposedly discussed, if it had been discussed at all. That was evidence prop number 3, and it mattered because agendas reveal intent. If towing had been a real policy shift, it would have been on an agenda. If it wasn't, then the tow threat was either made up on the fly or quietly improvised by someone who didn't think anyone would demand receipts. I saved that follow-up as another PDF. Then I took a breath and did the part that felt like setting a quiet trap. I didn't warn them. I didn't announce it. I just made sure my 2 neutral witnesses were aware that the noon deadline had passed, the association still hadn't confirmed anything in writing, and the threat remained unresolved. If a tow truck came later, it would look even worse for the committee because the deadline urgency would be proven as theater. That evening, a new email finally arrived that looked like it had been written by someone who realized I wasn't panicking. It included a partial rule citation, but it was the same nuisance-style catch-all they'd tried earlier, the kind of clause that could be stretched to cover anything if you squint hard enough. They claimed my driveway parking was inconsistent with community standards, and they suggested I avoid further penalties by storing the vehicle in my garage. Still no towing policy. Still no authority. Still no hearing schedule. That was the moment I decided my retaliation would shift from defense to exposure. Because they weren't going to stop just because I asked nicely. They were going to stop when the cost of targeting me became higher than the satisfaction of it. I replied, once more, with a very narrow set of questions that cornered them without me ever sounding emotional. I asked whether they considered my vehicle an emergency hazard under the enforcement procedure, and if so, what hazard it created. I asked whether a tow had been authorized, and if so, by whom, by role, and under what board-approved policy. I asked them to provide the enforcement log showing similar violations and similar action taken for other homeowners. And then I added one line that changed everything. If they were relying on complaints, I requested that any complaints be preserved and included in the record. Preserved. Record. Those are words people don't like when they're being sloppy. For the first time, the association didn't respond within a few hours. They went quiet again. And quiet, in this kind of situation, usually means one of two things. They're either scrambling to find something that supports their threat, or they're arguing internally about how far to go. The next morning, the neighborhood looked even more normal than the day before. Sunlight brightened the street in a hard, clean way that made everything feel exposed, and a few neighbors were out doing routine weekend chores. My driveway looked the same as it always had. My car sat centered and calm, like it didn't know it had become a symbol. I kept documenting anyway. By mid-morning, I received a final notice. They'd printed it on what looked like a more official template, and it included a fine amount this time, an administrative penalty for noncompliance. Not massive, but enough to sting and, more importantly, enough to establish a pattern. Once they fine you once, they treat it like permission to keep fining you. This one was dated and titled in a way that made it feel heavier. Final notice dated May 12th. The date didn't make sense for this situation. Today wasn't May 12th. It was months later, which meant they had reused an old template or recycled a previous notice date to make it look like this had been ongoing longer than it had. That single detail was the kind of mistake that ruins a bully's credibility. I photographed it, saved it, and added a note in my log. Final notice date inconsistent with current timeline. And then I did what I'd been building toward. I requested a meeting with the committee through the proper channel and stated I would be bringing my documentation for review. Not a confrontation. A review. The process. That phrasing matters. People who thrive on drama hate process because process makes them boring. The board responded faster than they had all week. Suddenly, they could schedule. Suddenly, they could communicate. They offered a short hearing window, and it was inconvenient on purpose, midday on a weekday. I adjusted my schedule and accepted. Because at this point, I wanted them on the record in front of their own rules. When the hearing day arrived, I walked in with my stapled stack and my calmest expression. I didn't bring a speech. I didn't bring a plan to embarrass anyone. I brought evidence and a timeline. They sat at a table like they were doing me a favor. The board role who had been emailing me was there. The treasurer was there. A third person, quiet and stiff, was there too. No one smiled. No one apologized. I didn't need them to. I laid out the facts the way you lay out dominoes. Tow threat by noon with no rule citation. My written request for authority. Their refusal to provide it. Their reliance on vague standards. The enforcement procedure requiring notice and hearing. The lack of any emergency justification. The inconsistent notice templates. The final notice, dated May 12th, that didn't match the actual timeline. I included my photos of my driveway. And then, carefully, I included the wider shots showing comparable driveway parking across the neighborhood, dated and time-stamped, without zooming in on anything identifying. I didn't accuse them of bias. I let the pattern speak. The temperature in the room changed when they realized I wasn't pleading for mercy. I was asking for consistency. They tried to pivot. They tried to say they were acting on complaints. They tried to reframe it as community concern. But I kept returning to the same 2 points. Show me the authority for towing, and show me the enforcement log demonstrating consistency. They couldn't, because they didn't have it. And then the quiet trap snapped shut, not with drama, but with a simple question I'd prepared. If the association cannot cite a governing document that prohibits driveway parking for personal vehicles, how can they justify any fine or tow threat at all? Silence followed. Not long, but long enough to feel like the entire table had run out of oxygen. That's when they tried one more angle, the most predictable one. They suggested I was being uncooperative, and they hinted that continued resistance could lead to more serious consequences. There was again the threat cycle. The implied legal consequence. The idea that if I didn't obey, something bigger would be activated. I didn't react. I just asked them to put that in writing and attach the governing authority for it. And suddenly, nobody wanted to threaten anything anymore. The board role cleared their throat and said they would pause enforcement while they review the applicable sections. They suggested they would update the community about parking clarification in a future communication. In other words, They were backing down without admitting they'd been wrong. I let them have that face-saving exit, because my goal wasn't to win an argument. My goal was to stop the harassment and expose the pattern. But I wasn't done. Before I left, I asked one more time for the enforcement log and complaint record, since I had requested it formally. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't act offended. I just treated it like routine process. They promised to look into it. 2 days later, I received a packet from the association. It wasn't everything I'd requested, but it was enough. It included a partial enforcement record that showed driveway standards had been cited in only a handful of cases over the past few months. And every single case had one thing in common: the same complaint source code. Not a name, but a code. The same one, again and again. They tried to hide the identity, but the pattern was obvious. One person was driving the enforcement. Ms. D. I didn't need a confession. I didn't need a screenshot of her sending messages. The log did the job. And now I had the kind of proof that changes how the committee behaves, because it shows they weren't responding to the neighborhood. They were responding to one obsessive observer. That's when my revenge became satisfying and still completely lawful. I wrote a calm follow-up letter to the board, attaching the enforcement procedure page, attaching the partial enforcement log, and referencing the hearing outcome. I requested that my fine be rescinded due to lack of cited authority and procedural inconsistency. I also requested that future driveway enforcement be applied uniformly, with written rule citations included in every notice, and that towing threats not be used unless board-approved policy exists and proper process is followed. Then, because the committee had tried to use social shame against me, I flipped that pressure back onto the process. I asked them to include a parking rules clarification in the next community newsletter with the exact rule citations, so every homeowner would know what was actually allowed. No more vague standards. No more intimidation codes. They couldn't refuse without revealing their own mess. The next newsletter came out, and it was the most careful piece of writing I'd ever seen from that committee. It clarified that personal vehicles may be parked in driveways as long as sidewalks are not blocked and no safety hazards exist. It referenced the actual section. It emphasized that enforcement would follow notice and hearing procedures. It didn't mention me. It didn't mention the tow threat. But it quietly erased the weapon they'd aimed at my driveway. And after that, something even stranger happened. The notices stopped. Not just for me. The whole tone of enforcement shifted. The committee started citing actual rule numbers. Deadlines became reasonable. Threat language disappeared. It was like someone had finally realized that sloppy intimidation creates backlash, and backlash creates scrutiny. Ms. D still watched sometimes. I still saw curtains move. But she stopped standing at the edge of her driveway like she owned the street. She stopped performing the role of unofficial enforcer. Because the committee had learned a painful lesson. When you let one person weaponize process, you end up owning their behavior. In the aftermath, my life returned to what I'd wanted when I moved here: quiet, predictable, boring. I won my fine reversal, my driveway stayed mine, and I never received another tow threat. But the cost was real: weeks of stress, hours of documentation, and that lingering sense that normalcy in an HOA can be revoked by someone else's obsession. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the light hits the mailbox just right, I still feel that flicker of tension, like I'm about to see another bright paper clip there. Then I remember the stack in my drawer, the timestamps, the procedures, and the way the committee went silent when asked to cite their own authority. If you've ever dealt with a tow threat over your driveway, like share, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment your HOA experience below. This tow truck threat HOA mess proves paper trails win. Thanks for watching. And just when I thought the neighborhood had finally learned its lesson, a new notice popped up on the community board the next week. Something about approved exterior items and unauthorized displays. I didn't even have to read the fine print to feel the old pressure return. Because once you've seen how quickly rules can become weapons, you start noticing the way the committee phrases things, the way deadlines appear, the way one neighbor's preferences can suddenly look like policy. I slipped my folder back into my bag, looked down the street, and saw Ms. D's curtains twitch again, just once. It wasn't over. It was just changing shape.